New York City, 1869. A man steps off a ferry with nothing left but his name. His name is Antonio Lopez de Santa Anna, 11-time president of Mexico, the general who lost Texas, the man who lost half his country's territory to the United States. Now he is exiled, broke, and desperate for a way back into power. He has one asset left, a trunk full of dried, hardened sap shipped up from the jungles of the Yucatan. He calls it chicle. Santa Anna does not want to sell gum. He wants to sell it as a rubber substitute, hoping the profits will fund an army, a comeback, a revolution. He hands the shipment to a New York inventor named Thomas Adams and asks him to turn into tires, toys, rain boots, anything mechanical, anything profitable. The rubber experiments fail. Every one of them. But one night, watching a young girl buy paraffin wax gum from a drugstore counter, Adams has a different idea. He melts down the leftover chicle, rolls it into small gray balls, and sells them for a penny apiece. Santa Anna never sees a cent. He dies in poverty 7 years later. The sap he shipped north to fund a war instead built an industry worth billions, one still sitting in nearly every pocket, purse, and vending machine on earth. But the story of chewing gum starts much earlier than a failed general and a broken inventor. It starts in the rainforest 1,000 years before either of them was born. Long before it was a commodity, chicle was a ritual. The sapodilla tree, Manilcara zapoda, grows wild across the lowland forests of the Yucatan Peninsula, southern Mexico, Belize, and Guatemala. Score its bark with a diagonal cut, and it bleeds a thick, milky latex. Left to dry and harden slightly, that latex becomes elastic, chewable, faintly sweet. The Maya called it sict or chicle, the root of the modern Spanish word chicle, and later, the English chicle itself. Archaeological evidence suggests the Maya were chewing this substance as early as 100 BCE and quite possibly earlier. Blocks of hardened chicle, marked with tooth impressions, have been recovered from Maya settlements, a 2,000-year-old snapshot of the same absent-minded habit practiced today. But the Maya did not chew casually the way modern people do. Chewing carried social weight. It cleaned the teeth and freshened the breath in a hot, humid climate where oral hygiene mattered enormously. It was also, in many communities, gendered and age-restricted, acceptable for children and unmarried women, but considered inappropriate, even shameful for adult men to chew in public. A man caught chewing gum on the street risked being seen as effeminate or predatory, since public chewing by men was sometimes associated with signaling romantic availability in ways considered inappropriate. This was not a trivial habit. It was governed by unspoken rules, the kind of small, ordinary behavior that reveals how a whole society organizes itself around gender, status, and public conduct. The Aztecs, centuries later, inherited and adapted the practice. They chewed a similar substance, sometimes chicle, sometimes a resin from other trees, and applied nearly identical social codes. Spanish missionaries and colonial chroniclers, arriving in the 16th century, noted the habit with a mixture of curiosity and disdain. One more primitive custom to be cataloged, criticized, and eventually forgotten by European record keepers. But it was not forgotten by the people who lived in that landscape. For over 1,000 years, chewing gum was not a candy. It was a quiet, continuous thread of daily life, as unremarkable and as essential as brushing your teeth is today. It was never just tree sap. It was a habit that carried its own invisible rulebook, one that would completely dissolve the moment it crossed into another culture with no memory of its meaning. Two entirely separate gum traditions existed in North America before they collided. In the forests of New England, indigenous peoples had long chewed the resin of spruce trees, valuing it for its sharp, clean taste and its ability to soothe the mouth and throat. European settlers, arriving in the 17th and 18th centuries, adopted the practice directly from native communities. By the early 1800s, spruce gum was being harvested, cut into small resin lumps, and sold commercially in American general stores, the first mass-marketed chewing gum in the United States, decades before chicle ever arrived. In 1848, a Maine entrepreneur named John B. Curtis began selling the state of Maine pure spruce gum in small wooden boxes, widely regarded as the first commercially packaged chewing gum in American history. It was crude, brittle, and often bitter, but it proved something important. Americans would pay money for something they didn't need to eat, didn't need to swallow, and served no nutritional purpose at all. They would pay simply for the sensation of chewing. Soon after, paraffin wax gum entered the market. Cheaper to produce, blander in flavor, but smoother in texture. By the mid-1800s, a strange new consumer category had quietly formed. Chewing as entertainment, chewing as habit, chewing with no destination and no purpose beyond the act itself. This is the cultural soil into which chicle would later be planted. Americans were already primed. They already understood the appeal. What they lacked was a raw material capable of scaling, something more elastic, more durable, more pleasant in the mouth than brittle spruce resin or greasy paraffin. That is exactly what Thomas Adams discovered by accident in his failed rubber experiments. When Adams rolled his first chicle-based gumballs in 1871, he wasn't inventing a new habit. He was solving an old problem with new material. Within a year, his small batch product, sold to a single drugstore in Hoboken, New Jersey, was outselling every other gum on the shelf. Word spread. Demand outpaced supply almost immediately. By 1888, Adams had built vending machines to sell gum on New York City subway platforms. Quite possibly the first vending machines in American history built for a consumer product. Gum wasn't just a candy anymore. It was becoming infrastructure, a small mechanical transaction, repeated millions of times, invisible in its scale. What looked like a minor drugstore novelty was quietly becoming something else entirely. The seed of an industry that would soon require entire forests, entire labor systems, and entire supply chains stretching from the jungles of Mexico to the factories of the American Northeast. The demand had been created. Now someone had to go and get the sap. By the 1890s, chewing gum had a problem. It was growing faster than the jungle could supply it. Thomas Adams's success sparked imitators almost immediately. William Wrigley Jr., a soap salesman turned gum baron, entered the market in 1891, initially giving away gum as a promotional gift with baking powder purchases before realizing the gum itself was the more popular product. By 1893, he had launched Juicy Fruit and Wrigley Spearmint, and within a generation, Wrigley's company would become the largest chewing gum manufacturer on Earth. But every stick of gum these companies sold depended on one thing: a steady, reliable flow of raw chicle out of Mexico and Central America. And that supply chain ran directly through some of the densest, most difficult rainforest terrain in the hemisphere. The Petén region of Guatemala, the forests of Quintana Roo, the borderlands of Belize. American gum companies did not send their own employees into that jungle. Instead, they built a layered system of contractors, middlemen, and exporters, a structure that let corporations in Chicago and New York profit enormously from a resource they never had to touch, harvested by workers they never had to meet. Mexican and Central American governments, meanwhile, saw opportunity in this demand. Chicle exports became a genuine economic pillar for the region. At its peak in the early 20th century, chicle was one of Mexico's most valuable export commodities, rivaling silver and henequen fiber in certain years. The Yucatan's economy, still recovering from the collapse of its henequen green gold boom, found a second export windfall in this humble tree sap. This is where the story stops being about candy and starts being about geopolitics. The United States, hungry for raw chicle, developed deep economic entanglement with Mexican regional governments and forest concessions, political relationships that would later intersect with land rights, labor law, and sovereignty disputes across the chicle-producing South. American companies lobbied for favorable export terms. Mexican officials, some legitimate and some deeply corrupt, granted harvesting concessions across vast stretches of forest, often with little regard for the indigenous and mestizo communities who lived and worked that land. By the 1920s, the trade had scaled into a genuine transnational commodity chain. Ships left Yucatan ports loaded with burlap sacks of dried chicle blocks, bound for Gulf Coast refineries in New Orleans and New York, where the raw sap would be cleaned, filtered, boiled, and blended into gum bases for a dozen competing American brands. It was never just chewing gum. It was an entire economic corridor, one that moved wealth north while leaving the labor, the risk, and the environmental cost behind in the South. And at the base of that corridor stood a workforce almost entirely invisible to the American consumers chewing the final product, the chicleros. To understand what chewing gum actually cost, you have to go into the jungle with the men who harvested it. Chicleros, chicle tappers, worked in brutal, remote conditions for months at a time, cut off from towns, families, and medical care. The work followed a seasonal rhythm dictated by rainfall. Chicle sap flows best during the rainy season, from July through February, which meant chicleros lived deep in the forest through the most dangerous, disease-heavy months of the year. The labor itself was punishing and precise. A chiclero would climb a sapodilla tree, sometimes over 30 meters tall, using nothing but a rope harness and metal climbing spikes strapped to his boots, then slash a diagonal zigzag pattern into the bark with a machete, letting the latex drip down into a canvas bag tied at the base. One tree could be tapped only once every several years without killing it, meaning chicleros had to range constantly deeper in a virgin forest to find untapped trees, walking for days between harvest sites. The dangers were constant and severe. Falls from height were common and often fatal. Venomous snakes, fer-de-lance, coral snakes, killed chicleros regularly, and there was rarely any way to get a bitten worker help in time. Malaria and yellow fever moved through work camps unchecked. Bandit violence and territorial disputes between rival harvesting crews sometimes turned deadly. And through it all, chicleros were frequently exploited by the very system that depended on them. Many chicleros worked under a debt peonage structure disturbingly similar to systems used decades earlier on henequen plantations. Labor contractors, often working on behalf of larger exporting companies, would advance workers food, tools, and supplies against future chicle deliveries, trapping them in cycles of debt that made it nearly impossible to leave the trade. A chiclero might spend an entire brutal season tapping trees, only to discover that the value of his harvest barely covered what he already owed for supplies advanced at the start. This was extraction dressed up as commerce. The forest gave its sap. The chicleros gave their bodies, their years, sometimes their lives. In an ocean away, a customer paid 1 cent for a stick of gum without ever knowing a name, a face, or a single detail of where it came from. It was never just chewing gum. It was a supply chain built on the same coercive architecture used across the history of colonial commodities: coffee, rubber, sugar, henequen, where the value created by the most dangerous labor accrued almost entirely to people who never once set foot in the forest. By the 1930s, labor organizers and some progressive Mexican officials began pushing back, forming chiclero cooperatives designed to negotiate better terms and cut out predatory middlemen. Some of these cooperatives achieved real gains, briefly giving chicleros more control over pricing and working conditions. But the entire system remained fundamentally fragile, dependent on a wild resource, a wild forest, and a foreign market with no loyalty to either. That fragility was about to be tested by something no chiclero, cooperative, or corporation could control. The chicle trade was dying long before most people realized it. Decades of aggressive, unregulated tapping had scarred the sapodilla forests of Yucatan and Petén beyond easy recovery. Trees that should have been given years to heal between harvests were being tapped repeatedly out of economic desperation, weakening or killing them outright. By the 1930s and 1940s, chicle yields were falling sharply across the region, even as global demand for chewing gum kept climbing. This was the first crack. The second came from a laboratory, not a jungle. American chemists, working through the early 20th century and accelerating dramatically during World War II, developed synthetic alternatives to natural chicle. Petroleum-based polymers like polyisobutylene and paraffin-derived waxes that could be manufactured predictably, cheaply, and infinitely, with no dependence on rainfall, tree health, or the labor of a single chiclero. The war made this shift urgent. Wartime rubber shortages disrupted global supply chains for nearly every latex-based product, chicle included, forcing American manufacturers to accelerate their search for synthetic substitutes out of sheer necessity. What began as a wartime workaround became a permanent industrial pivot. This changed everything. By the 1950s, most major American gum brands had quietly transitioned away from natural chicle entirely, replacing it with synthetic gum-based blends that were cheaper, more consistent, and infinitely scalable. Wrigley, once dependent on Mexican and Central American chicle imports, shifted almost entirely to synthetic formulations. The forest that had once been essential now became optional. For the chicleros, this was catastrophic. An industry that had employed tens of thousands of workers across Mexico, Guatemala, and Belize began to collapse from the demand side, not the supply side. It wasn't that the trees ran out, it was that the world stopped needing them. Entire communities that had organized their economies around seasonal chicle harvesting were left with a market that had simply moved on, no negotiation required, no warning given. The jungle that had built an industry became irrelevant to it within a single generation. Meanwhile, back in American factories, chewing gum entered its second great transformation. It became a fully industrialized, endlessly reproducible product. Automated mixing, rolling, cutting, and wrapping machinery allowed companies to produce gum at a volume and consistency that would have been unimaginable to Thomas Adams in his small Hoboken workshop. Flavor chemists developed synthetic mint, fruit, and cinnamon compounds far more stable and intense than anything derived from natural ingredients. Gum was no longer a jungle commodity refined by American companies. It was now a fully synthetic, fully industrial product, manufactured, branded, and marketed with almost no connection at all to the ancient, sacred, labor-intensive tradition that had made it possible in the first place. The sap was gone. The industry it built was only getting started. If chicle built the chewing gum industry, marketing is what made it an American institution. William Wrigley Jr. understood something that few of his competitors grasped early enough. Gum wasn't just a product, it was a mood, a habit, an identity people could buy for a nickel. Wrigley poured enormous sums into advertising at a time when most companies barely bothered. By the 1910s and 1920s, his company was one of the largest print advertisers in the United States, plastering spearmint and juicy fruit branding across billboards, magazines, and eventually radio. Then came the moment that would permanently fuse chewing gum to American identity, World War II. The U.S. military included chewing gum in soldiers' field ration kits, believing it helped relieve stress, mask hunger, improve concentration, and keep mouths occupied during long stretches of tense, silent waiting. Wrigley shifted its entire civilian production line to military supply, pulling its own gum off American store shelves for the duration of the war, so soldiers overseas could have it instead. This wasn't just patriotism. It was one of the most effective product placements in the history of consumer branding. Never repeated, never engineered, but perfect all the same. American GIs carried gum into Europe, North Africa, and the Pacific, often trading sticks of it with local civilians, children, and soldiers from other nations who had never encountered anything like it. Gum became shorthand for something bigger than itself. American abundance, American ease, American cultural reach delivered one stick at a time. Photographs and personal accounts from the era repeatedly describe European children running toward American soldiers, shouting for gum before anything else, even food. Chewing gum had become, quite literally, an instrument of soft power. That association only deepened during the Cold War. American gum brands, alongside Coca-Cola and Blue Jeans, became potent symbols of Western consumer culture behind the Iron Curtain, a small, portable, unmistakably American object that represented an entire way of life to people who weren't allowed to have it. Black markets for Western chewing gum flourished in parts of the Soviet bloc for decades. Back home, the post-war era transformed gum into a fully modern consumer category, segmented, branded, and endlessly diversified. Bubble gum, invented in 1928 by a Fleer chewing gum company employee named Walter Deemer, added an entirely new dimension. Gum as performance, as childhood ritual, as something you didn't just chew but blew, popped, and competed over. Sugar-free gum arrived in the 1950s and expanded dramatically from the 1970s onward, driven by growing public anxiety about dental health and rising obesity rates. By the late 20th century, chewing gum manufacturers had begun actively marketing their product as something bordering on medicinal, gum that whitened teeth, gum that curbed appetite, gum that delivered caffeine, gum that helped people quit smoking through controlled nicotine release. The industry had learned to sell gum not just as pleasure, but as self-improvement. It was never just chewing gum. It had become therapy, patriotism, rebellion, and self-control, repackaged and resold as a 2-inch stick you could buy at any checkout counter on Earth. If you've made it this far into the hidden history of something this small, consider subscribing, because the next everyday object we cover might already be sitting in your kitchen right now. Today, the global chewing gum market is worth tens of billions of dollars annually, and almost none of it touches a rainforest. The chicleros are largely gone. Some cooperative harvesting operations still survive in pockets of the Yucatan and Petén, and in recent years a small niche market for natural or organic chicle-based gum has reemerged, marketed to consumers concerned about plastic and synthetic ingredients. An ironic, quiet echo of an industry the mainstream market abandoned 70 years ago. But these operations are a fraction of what once employed tens of thousands of workers across Mexico, Guatemala, and Belize. What replaced them is almost entirely synthetic, and that shift has created a very different kind of consequence. Most modern chewing gum base is a blend of synthetic rubber polymers, essentially a form of plastic. That means the vast majority of gum chewed today does not biodegrade. It persists stuck to sidewalks, benches, and undersides of desks for years, and increasingly identified by researchers as a contributor to global microplastic pollution, breaking down into microscopic particles that enter waterways and eventually food systems. The habit itself has never lost its cultural charge, either. Gum remains a fixture of athletic sidelines, courtrooms, classrooms, and long flights. A small, quiet piece of self-regulation millions of people reach for without a second thought. Smoking cessation programs still rely heavily on nicotine gum. Dentists still recommend sugar-free gum to stimulate saliva production and protect enamel. The habit that began as a hygienic, socially coded practice among the Maya has, in a strange full circle, returned to being marketed partly as an oral health product. What hasn't changed is the basic shape of the story. An ordinary object, chewed absent-mindedly by billions of people, sitting at the intersection of ancient tradition, colonial-style extraction, industrial chemistry, wartime diplomacy, and modern environmental crisis. Every pack of gum in a checkout aisle carries all of it. The Maya taboos, the exiled general, the chicleros who climbed 30-meter trees for pennies, the wartime soldiers who made it a symbol of freedom, and the synthetic chemistry that eventually made the entire natural trade obsolete. It was never just chewing gum. It rarely is. A stick of gum lasts, at most, 20 minutes in your mouth before it loses its flavor and gets thrown away. But the history behind it stretches back 2,000 years, through Maya ritual, colonial trade routes, a bankrupt Mexican general, a jungle full of desperate laborers, a world war, and a laboratory breakthrough that made the whole natural trade disappear almost overnight. That's the pattern behind almost everything ordinary. The object in your hand rarely tells you where it's been. If this is the kind of hidden history you want more of, subscribe. There are dozens of everyday objects with stories just as strange as this one waiting to be told. And I want to know, what part of this story surprised you the most? The exiled general who started it all? The chicleros risking their lives 30 meters up a tree? Or the fact that most gum today isn't even natural anymore? Drop it in the comments, and let me know what everyday object you think deserves the crumb lore treatment next.